วัสดีค่ะ The International Monetary Fund recently announced that it was cutting growth forecasts for both the U.S. and Europe. How are the U.S. and Europe managing its debt crisis? And how best can Thailand prepare for a turbulent global economy? I talked to an analyst from Fitch ratings agency. IMF Chief Christine Lagarde recently warned that the world economy is in a dangerous new phase. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it's interesting that there's a divergent economic performance going on between the so-called advanced economies and the developing world. And indeed, that's something that we are continuing to reflect in our sovereign ratings. The global crisis since 2008 has yielded new information about the underlying economic trends between, as I say, the advanced economies and the developing world. And that's something we're continuing to reflect in our sovereign ratings.
Are we going to see a double dip, as many people say?
I think that's far from a done deal. I think there is a divergence between the confidence type indicators, survey-based indicators, in particular coming from the US, and the hard data that we've seen. And now we're expecting quite an important jobs report from the US later today, but just thinking back to the July consumption report, it was actually pretty solid. So as I say, a divergence between the survey-based indicators and what the hard numbers are telling us. Undoubtedly, there was a soft patch in Q1 and Q2 in the US. We think that was to a large extent due to supply disruptions following the tragic disaster in Japan in March, and also because of higher global oil prices as a result of geopolitical turbulence in the Middle East particularly. So a key thing will be to track to what extent the US economy rebounds and makes up for that soft patch, and whether the slowdown was indeed due to these more temporary factors, or whether it tells us something new about the trajectory for the US economy. The euro area we do expect to slow, but that's to some extent a reflection of its asymmetrically strong performance in 2010 and earlier this year, in particular on the back of the strength of German export industry. In Japan, we expect a continued rebound driven by reconstruction spending following the March disasters. Meanwhile, continued strong growth in most of the developing world.
Okay, so let's take the U.S. first. What is the state of the U.S. economy right now?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think it's difficult to get a firm read based on the discrepancy between what some of the forward-looking indicators are telling us, which doesn't look too good, versus what the hard data that we have to date is saying, which is rather more mixed. Certainly not as strong as we would expect at this stage normally of a recovery. Fitch has looked back at US recoveries since 1957, and the recovery path this time is the weakest of any recovery since then, and that reflects the damage done to the economy by the ongoing process of deleveraging and the bursting of the housing bubble since 2008.
So 2008 is the cause of today's sort of slowdown of the U.S. economy?
In a broader, longer-term sense, yes. The softer patch of the recovery that we saw in the first half of this year, I've mentioned, we ascribe more to temporary factors. But the big question is how much output has been lost from the US economy permanently as a result of the global financial crisis and the financial crisis in the US in particular, and how much of the lost output of the recession we will see made back as the recovery proceeds.
Is Washington's deficit reduction effort sufficient for the stability of the US economy looking into the future?
Well, our perspective, our key interest obviously is in the sovereign ratings, and Fitch has recently affirmed the US sovereign rating at AAA with a stable outlook. Nonetheless, we've said that we think the US will be straining the limits of its AAA status, even on current fiscal projections, embodying the fiscal tightening measures that the Joint Congressional Committee has been mandated to achieve or to decide on by the end of November. And if we see either any backsliding on fiscal tightening in the US, or if, to refer to our earlier discussion, if we see more evidence that more output has been lost permanently as a result of the crisis, and if the economy doesn't rebound as we expect, these things could lead us to look again at the US ratings.
Now, how bad is the sovereign debt crisis in Europe?
I think it's interesting. Something I was looking at yesterday in my talk was the similarity in the public debt levels between the euro area and the US. In the euro area, in aggregate, public debt is about 85% of GDP. In the US, it's about 90%. But nonetheless, the US is paying very low yields on its debt, and there's no obvious sign of funding pressure on the US sovereign, whereas some euro area countries are paying quite elevated yields on their debt. The three more troubled smaller economies of Portugal, Ireland and Greece so far have received formal support packages from the EU and from the IMF. And worryingly, in the summer we saw a run-up in the yields that Italy and Spain were being asked to pay at their debt auctions. Now, why that's more worrying is that Italy and Spain are much bigger economies than Ireland, Portugal and Greece. Now, those three smaller countries are only 7% of euro area GDP, even taken together. Italy is about 16% of euro area GDP. So the cost of any support to that country, if it were needed, would be much bigger. For the core, as it were, of the euro area, based around Germany, to meet. Now, we think, as the ratings indicate, and Italy is rated AA-, Spain at AA+, so these are still high ratings. So we think that the run-up in yields over the summer was to some extent unwarranted, and I think that's the view that the ECB has taken. So when they've stepped up their purchases of Italian and Spanish government debt, which has acted to calm the markets, I think the ECB, and this is my own view, were acting out of the perception that the run-up in yields was a market dysfunction and was not a reflection of the solvency position of those two countries. Now, if the view in our ratings and the ECB's view is correct, then the problem at the euro area should be containable within the current framework that the European authorities have in place to manage it.
Mm-hmm. How strong is Germany and France?
Germany and France are both rated AAA with a stable outlook, and therefore clearly remain among the world's strongest credits. I think that concerns about France, to the extent that they have been voiced in the market, reflect concerns about the French banking system, primarily at this period reflect concerns about the French banking system's exposures to the sovereign debt of the more troubled euro area countries. Now, Fitch has written reports and research on this, highlighting the quite low exposure relative to, say, their equity of French banks to, say, Greek, Irish and Portuguese debt. Spanish and Italian exposures would be a different question. However, as I've said, we regard the market stress that affected Spain and Italy as more of a liquidity issue, a short-run liquidity issue, rather than telling us anything about the solvency of those sovereigns, as the ratings would indicate. And hence, that would tend to suggest that the concerns over France also have been overdone.
Mm-hmm. What are the root causes of the European debt crisis?